Everybody, my name is Sarah Rozier and I'm the news editor at Ballotpedia. Today we're going to be talking about the fight for the heart of the primaries in the 2018 primaries. So right now where we are at in the cycle, we are completed 29 of the primaries to come in 2018. So that means we're about 40% of the way through the nation's primary contests. I'm sorry, I said that opposite. We still have 40% of the primaries left still to come. So we are halfway through, we're a little bit halfway through, but we still have a good chunk of them in August and September. And then of course we have Louisiana's system where the primaries and the general are concurrent in November. So we've heard quite a bit so far about the factioning of the party in the wake of the 2016 elections and what that's meant for both Democrats and Republicans. We're talking about the idea of, will Republicans run with Trump or from Trump? Will the Bernie faction of the Democratic Party see traction in 2018? These are all questions that have kind of been simmering for the last couple of months. So with me today, we have Corey Ugalito. He's the editor of Ballotpedia's Marquee team, which is the team of writers at Ballotpedia responsible for covering these races that are garnering the most intrigue, the most attention, the most money from the campaigns and from satellite spending. So thanks for joining us today, Corey.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's get started. Let's take a look back at what has happened in the past few months. Walk me through the basics. So how many incumbents have lost? How are the candidate lists shaping up? Just where are we right now in the cycle?
Yeah, sure. So like you mentioned, primaries are complete. So that means primaries in states that have runoffs. The runoffs are also complete in 29 states. If we start just with the candidate lists for Congress, there are, as of July 27th, 2,604 candidates running for Congress. The largest number, 1,176, are Democrats, followed by 1,018 Republicans. Democrats, at least in the House, are contesting a larger number of seats than in the past. There are only 4 districts so far in the country without a Democratic candidate running, compared to 39 districts without a Republican candidate running. Those 4 Democratic seats are California's 8th, Georgia's 8th, Michigan's 1st, and North Carolina's 3rd. So that's kind of just a landscape, a big picture of numbers, at least for congressional primaries. There have been 4 congressional or state executive incumbents that have lost primary elections so far. Those are Mark Sanford in South Carolina's 1st district, who lost to Katie Arrington, Robert Pittenger in North Carolina's 9th district, Joe Crowley in one of the bigger stories of the year in New York's 14th, and then Mike Stack, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. So those are the 4 congressional or state executive incumbents that have lost. And then at the state legislative level, 86 incumbents have lost primary elections so far, 38 Democrats and 48 Republicans. So in other words, 86% of Democratic incumbents at the state legislative level and 87% of Republican incumbents who ran in a primary won their primary. For context, we've seen 86 state legislative incumbents lose so far primary elections this year. There were 123 state legislative incumbents who lost primaries in all of 2016. So there's a good chance we surpass that number, I would say, but we'll have to see how that shapes up. So yeah, that's a sort of an introductory look at some of the numbers so far.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting statistics this year is looking at that number you mentioned about 4 districts that don't have a Democratic candidate. So if you look back at the previous couple of cycles, that does seem pretty low. It fits this common narrative that we've seen in the media that Democrats are trying to at least compete in more elections. And that number, that 4, fell from 36 districts in 2014 that didn't have a Democratic candidate but had a Republican running. So yeah, these numbers, we're seeing a lot more candidates. We're seeing a lot more districts that have both parties running rather than, oh, well, we're just going to chalk this up to being a safe Republican hold or a safe Democratic hold. So those numbers are really interesting to look at. Now, in some of these races, we're seeing open seats, meaning that the incumbent is not running for re-election in 2018. Walk me through some of the noteworthy primary battles that have occurred in seats where there isn't an incumbent running in these open seats.
Yeah, sure. So these are really interesting cases. Incumbency has a lot of advantages, and incumbents tend to be reelected at a higher rate than others. So whenever there's an open seat, there's a greater chance, in some sense, of that seat changing party hands. So these are really interesting primaries. There are right now 3 senators and 55 House members not seeking re-election this year. So that's 55 districts without an incumbent. The most notable situation in terms of primaries has been in Texas. Their primaries and primary runoffs happened early in the season. But what was interesting is that 6 congressional races where there's an open seat where an incumbent is not running for re-election went to runoffs because no candidate earned 50% of the vote to secure the nomination outright in the first round of voting. So 6 congressional races went to runoffs. All 6 featured a retiring incumbent. 5 of the races were to replace retiring Republicans, and the 6th was to replace a retiring Democrat. Those 5 runoffs to replace Republican incumbents attracted a lot of interest and influencers like the House Freedom Caucus, the Club for Growth, the Texas Association of Business. Rick Perry was involved in quite a few of them. And a major division among the candidates was whether or not they would join the House Freedom Caucus if they're elected. In 3 of those primaries, the 5th, 6th, and 27th districts, candidates likely to join the Freedom Caucus ran directly against candidates who were unlikely to join the House Freedom Caucus. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, the House Freedom Caucus candidates won 3 runoffs. Non-Freedom Caucus candidates won 2. So that was an interesting battle that kind of shapes, if these people are elected to Congress in November, that's going to shape sort of the balance of power within the Republican Party and in the House of Representatives. Another interesting case with a retiring incumbent was California's 49th district, where Darrell Issa is not running for re-election. Before California's top 2 primaries, there was a lot of concern that crowded Democratic fields would result in the Democratic vote being split up among a lot of different candidates and lead to a situation where there's no Democrat on the general election ticket, where Republicans would take both of the top 2 spots and basically lock Democrats out of the election in November. Ultimately, that didn't happen in the 49th or in any other districts, but it was a real concern, particularly in that one district. And the 2 candidates that did advance, one Republican and one Democrat, are Diane Harkey and Mike Levin. So yeah, those are 2 of the most interesting cases where incumbents are retiring.
Yeah, I love how sometimes we'll just be kind of going through the motions of primary season, and then we'll get these interesting cases like California with top 2, Washington State has top 2, of course the whole Louisiana system coming up, and then we also have states like Texas and I think Alabama and Arkansas, a few others. I think there's a total of 11 where candidates don't just need a majority, they need a full plurality. So they need 50% plus 1. In some states, I think it's even, they need, if they don't have that whole threshold, it's 40% plus 1. And so that causes these layered primary battles like we saw in Texas where, all right, 2 candidates got through the first round, now it's a head-to-head primary race, and those can draw lots of money, as they did. They drew lots of endorsements, lots of national attention. There are no more primaries like that this cycle where all that's needed is the majority rather than, I'm sorry, I said that wrong again. The am I saying that right, Corey? Plurality, right?
Yes.
Yes, they need the plurality. So we won't have any more runoffs the rest of the cycle.
Sorry to interrupt. We do have Oklahoma runoffs.
Still to come, right?
Still to come, yeah. So the first round.
Right. Okay, yeah. So we will have that, but a lot of those interesting situations we saw in Texas, and then we'll still have things like the Washington top two primary, and those situations. But yeah, that California seeing, all right, well, we have in some races, well, we have the Dem versus Dem in the general, like we have with the Senate election with Feinstein and De Leon. We've seen that quite a bit throughout the cycle. So speaking of, races like the California Senate, what has your team noticed about the central topics of the battles in the Democratic Party?
Yeah. One important topic has been the role of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or the DCCC, and their involvement in Democratic primaries. Their Red to Blue program gives candidates organizational and fundraising support, but a lot of people have criticized the DCCC's choices in terms of who they're giving that support to, and claimed that they're not always supporting the sufficiently progressive candidate. So we've tracked 22 Democratic primaries so far this season where the DCCC backed a candidate before the primary, and then we've looked at the results of those. And the DCCC is doing pretty well in those battles. We've counted that DCCC endorsed candidates have won 20 of those races, and the challengers have won 2. So those challengers were Kara Eastman in Nebraska and Dana Balter in New York's 24th. So that's been one of the big topics of debate. And to some extent, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's victory over incumbent Joe Crowley in New York's 14th congressional district has started to feed a narrative of what you could call a progressive versus moderate battle within the party. Would Democrats have a better shot taking back the House and Senate with what you could call more moderate candidates, or are they going to perform better by embracing more progressive or democratic socialist policies? So that victory, which happened just at the end of June, so before there was kind of a nice break in July in the primary schedule, has sort of fed that narrative. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has now gone on the road for more candidates across the country, in places, campaigning at times with Bernie Sanders. So that'll be interesting to see now that we're back in the heart of primary season and the races are going to pick up again. Whether that momentum kind of continues and is part of a larger trend, or if it was just sort of a one-off event. So yeah, those are two things that we've observed.
It's so interesting to look back between the New York upset, and then you look at the Pennsylvania special election where Connor Lamb defeated Rick Saccone in the pretty red district, and just kind of the think pieces that followed that, right? So you saw Connor Lamb win as a Democrat, as a very moderate Democrat in that district, winning his primary and then going on to win the general. And all we heard after that was, yep, you just got to put up these moderate candidates and blue waves. And then you saw the defeat of Crowley in New York, and the narrative flipped on its head, right? Oh, I think the answer to this, really, when you look at this, is a Connor Lamb may not win in New York 14th, but Ocasio-Cortez probably wouldn't win in a Pennsylvania. So it has been interesting to see these factions form and kind of the narratives that come after it and everything encompassed in that. So kind of the same questions, but for Republicans, what issues are you noticing on the Republican side?
Yeah, and just related to what you were just saying, it demonstrates, I think, that every race and district and candidate is unique. And at times you're running a risk by trying to identify trends when things might be best described as one-off events. So we'll have to see what happens. So moving over to Republicans, two trends, I guess you could say, have been the involvement and importance of Donald Trump, and then in the House, what we already talked about, future membership in the House Freedom Caucus. Trump, we've tallied now 7 Senate endorsements and 9 House endorsements, and there are more coming often, it seems, where Trump has issued full-throated endorsements, and even more races where he's issued more vague statements of support. But a lot of those endorsements and statements of support have come in contested Republican primaries, often shortly before the race. And that has sort of changed dynamics of races pretty quickly in some cases. He backed Katie Arrington in her challenge and ultimate upset over Mark Sanford in South Carolina's 1st district, Martha Roby in Alabama, Dan Donovan in New York 11. And then in gubernatorial races, Brian Kemp in Georgia and Henry McMaster in South Carolina. All of those candidates won, and they had Trump's support. I think we're likely to see even more Trump involvement in upcoming primaries too. He stepped in a big way to the Florida gubernatorial Republican primary, tweeting in support of Ron DeSantis. And now we've seen DeSantis, who's running against Adam Putnam, make his support from Trump an absolute central argument of his campaign. So that's played a big role and will continue to play a big role, I think. Then the second item I was going to talk about is the House Freedom Caucus question. Congressmen like Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan, leaders of the House Freedom Caucus, are supporting candidates in primaries who they think are likely to join the ranks of the House Freedom Caucus if they're elected. Other caucuses more closely allied with leadership include satellite groups like the Republican Main Street Partnership, the Republican Study Committee, and these factions have faced off a bit in primaries that ultimately could shape who succeeds Paul Ryan as leader of Republicans in the House, whether or not Republicans hold the majority. So we've tracked competitive open Republican primaries where the Freedom Caucus or its leaders are backing a candidate, or where candidates have said they would join the House Freedom Caucus if elected. We've found that House Freedom Caucus affiliates have won 7 of those races. Non-House Freedom candidates have won 6. So there's been a pretty even split. But, every case could ultimately matter in deciding what leadership of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives looks like after 2018.
Fascinating. And I know it's even come up in a few races too on the Democratic side about whether they'd vote to reelect Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. And so all of these primaries, even if the general election, even if the winner of the primary we expect them to then go on to win the general, it does matter because it's going to shape the leadership too. If we see a whole bunch of House Freedom Caucus freshmen come in, that's going to shape who's going to take over Paul Ryan's spot in 2018, and same on the Democratic side. So you will see lots of mention of this issue in particular as we get through the cycle. Who are the other power players of 2018?
Good question. So we cover Power Players weekly in our Heart of the Primaries newsletter, which everybody should sign up for. That's on this call at ballotpedia.org. But I'll just throw out some names that we've covered in greater detail. On the Republican side, we've already talked, obviously, about Donald Trump, the House Freedom Fund, the Republican Main Street Partnership, and others like Ted Cruz has gotten involved in a number of races, Susan B. Anthony list, the National Rifle Association, Restoration PAC. There are a lot of satellite groups playing in all of these races. On the Democratic side, groups that have been particularly active supporting progressive challengers include Justice Democrats, Our Revolution, Brand New Congress, the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, and then who we've already talked about, Bernie Sanders, and now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Other power players that are often at odds with some of these groups are the DCCC, Emily's List, the Working Families Party in New York. Tom Steyer is spending a lot of money and running a lot of different groups in these Democratic primaries. So, yeah, that's just a sample of a ton of activity that's happening every day.
Okay, so in the next week, we have Tennessee tomorrow. We have Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, and Washington State on the 7th. What races will you guys be watching, and what races should we be watching in this next week for these primaries?
Yeah, there's some really interesting ones. I'll start with the Democratic side, where the Democratic primary in Kansas's 3rd congressional district has gotten really interesting. There are 6 Democrats hoping to challenge Republican Kevin Yoder in that district. Hillary Clinton won the district by 1% in 2016, but they obviously elected a Republican to Congress. So there's hope that this could be a seat that Democrats might flip. So you've got 6 candidates running. There's a labor lawyer, Brent Welder, who's been endorsed by Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez. Sharice Davids, a lawyer and economic advisor, is running with Emily's List support and highlighting her experience working on economic development programs on Native American reservations. Jay Seide, who's a businessman and was the 2016 Democratic nominee, is also running in the primary on sort of an updated platform. He's supporting a $15 minimum wage and single-payer healthcare. There are other candidates, Mike McCammon, a teacher, Tom Neerman, and Sylvia Williams. So you've got a previous nominee running. You've got endorsements from big progressive people popular with progressives like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Emily's List backing a third candidate. So there's a lot of factional conflict at play here. And it's going to be, like I said, Democrats are hoping this is a race they can win and pick up the seat. So that's one to keep your eye on. Another is Michigan's 11th congressional district. This is a potentially vulnerable seat that's being vacated by retiring David Trott. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is targeting the seat. It's a suburban Detroit seat in the general election, but they haven't endorsed a candidate yet in the primary. 4 top candidates include Sunil Gupta, who is actually, I think, the brother of Sanjay Gupta. He's raised the most money and has the support of 314 Action, which backs candidates specifically with scientific backgrounds. Haley Stevens is a candidate who is endorsed by the Michigan Teamsters, and she's focused her campaign on experience in manufacturing policy. Tim Greimel is the former state House Minority Leader, and he's backed by former Senator Carl Levin from Michigan, education groups, and some labor unions. And then Feiruz Saad is a former Obama administration official. She's sort of aligned with the progressive wing. She's been endorsed by the Bernie Sanders-aligned Justice Democrats and the group Democracy for America. So that's another case where there are just a lot of different factional conflicts at play in a Democratic primary. Moving over to the Republican side, the primary in Michigan's 11th is also important there. This, like I said before, this is an open seat, so both nominees are going to be vitally important to who actually wins in November. So there are 5 candidates running in the same district on the Republican side, including a former congressman, 3 former state legislators, and the former co-chair of Donald Trump's Michigan campaign in 2016. So that's a really interesting one. One more I'll talk about for Tennessee is, or 2 more actually I have on the list here. The Tennessee governor's race, the Republican primary. There are 6 candidates running, including Congresswoman Diane Black. Businessmen Randy Boyd and Bill Lee are also top candidates there. Black has support from President Trump, the NRA, and others, and she's making the case that she's the most conservative candidate in the race. And she's accused those businessmen, Randy Boyd and Bill Lee, of having argued that she's too conservative and of describing themselves as moderates. Boyd and Lee both focus on their business backgrounds, and there are some interesting endorsements. Boyd has attacked Black as an out-of-touch Washington politician. He's been backed by former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee and 50 of the state's 95 county mayors. Bill Lee was endorsed by a former candidate, May Beavers, after she suspended her campaign. Another candidate in that race is the Tennessee State House Speaker, Beth Harwell. She's been endorsed by some education association and state employee unions. And then a former gubernatorial candidate, Basil Marceau, and Kay White are also running. So that's going to be an interesting one where we'll see ultimately what role President Trump's endorsement plays in that Senate race. And then a final interesting primary is sort of a group of primaries in the Kansas state legislature. There are we've identified 22. Let me back up a little bit. There are 31 Kansas State House Republican primaries on August 7th. 22 of those 31 feature conflicts between supporters and opponents of former Governor Sam Brownback's 2012 tax cut package. They passed that tax cut package ultimately repealed it last year, and it's still lingering as an issue in these state legislative primaries. So if the Republicans can hold their 85-40 majority in the state House, the pro-Brownback faction needs just 41 members to sustain a gubernatorial veto of legislation passed by an anti-Brownback faction and Democrats. So there's going to be a really interesting outcome in those groups of primaries.
Yeah, that tax cut package really seems to be an issue at basically every statewide level in Kansas. So, anything can happen there next week with some of that.
It's amazing that's been going on. They originally passed that in 2012, and here it is still a central issue.
Wow. Cool. Interesting. Fascinating. So it sounds like a really busy week we have up ahead. After August 7th, what do you consider to be the biggest primaries that remain?
Really quite a few. It's a really exciting time. So between August 11th and September 13th, there are going to be primaries in Hawaii, Connecticut, Minnesota, South Dakota, Vermont, Wisconsin, Alaska, Wyoming, Arizona, Florida, runoffs in Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Delaware, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and then state level primaries in New York to wrap it all up. So there's a lot up ahead. There are a lot of really interesting gubernatorial primaries. Top races for Democrats are going to be the Minnesota gubernatorial primary, Wisconsin gubernatorial primary to figure out who's going to face Scott Walker as he runs for election again in Wisconsin, and then the Florida gubernatorial race. That's a big race on both sides. So as we pivot to the Republican race, the Republican side, the Florida gubernatorial race is absolutely one of the top races. The Arizona Senate Republican primary is another huge race that features Joe Arpaio, Martha McSally, and Kelly Ward. And then the Wyoming gubernatorial race as well. Wyoming is a pretty safely Republican state, but that Republican primary, is ultimately going to shape who could likely win in November. And there's a lot of money being spent in that Republican primary right now.
Great. Just kind of a final fun question. What's been your favorite race to just cover this cycle? What's personally been your favorite one?
Yeah, so I picked two, which is kind of cheating, but New York's 14th was really exciting. It shocked a lot of people, but with Ballotpedia's scope of coverage, we'd had our eye on it for months. We couldn't have predicted, I don't think, the outcome, but it was really exciting to see a story that we've been following for so long really blow up and take the country by storm. So that was personally very satisfying. And then another was the Georgia gubernatorial Republican primary. Brian Kemp finished about 15% behind Casey Cagle in the May 22nd primary, and then 2 months later beat Cagle by almost 40 points on July 24th. Some people, discuss the role of Donald Trump's endorsement of Kemp in that race. But I think kind of regardless of the cause, which is going to be difficult to pin down, that's a pretty amazing turnaround. 15% behind to winning by nearly 40 points in a runoff is fascinating. So yeah, those are two that have stood out to me.
The power of these states that allow runoff elections. So it can change an outcome. So thank you for this information, Corey. And if you've been listening and would like to receive our weekly Heart of the Primaries newsletter that will continue through the rest of the primary season, we've been tracking everything you've heard about today, plus lots of other features, including guest columns, all the recent polls, money, the power players, etc. So if you head to ballotpedia.org, on the right-hand side of that page, you'll see an icon to sign up for our Heart of the Primaries newsletter, which I'd encourage you to do, and stay in the know with all of the variety of other newsletters we offer and our daily products. So please stay tuned with us as we get closer to the November elections, and thanks again